Welcome to the recording of Sprout Lab's How to Make Learning Work webinar. This isn't a live recording. What we do after the sessions is we do a recording that's a summary of some of the interactive activities. We don't record the live sessions because we find in actual fact people are less interactive during the sessions. I'm Robin Petter, the founder and director of Sprout Labs, and also the person who ends up doing a lot of the webinars and a lot of our communication around how we work and our content. A little bit about what we do. So our essential elevator pitch is we work with organizations to design learning ecosystems that accelerate expertise. We actually work quite often with the 70-20-10 learning model, and a really core part of what we do is work with social learning and embedding that into the model and approach. We work across these four areas of strategy, design, development, technologies, and implementation. So essentially, at the strategy end of things around social learning, we're looking at things like design and community of practices. Design and development is building learning activities, Sparks, which I'll talk a little bit about later. We have a technology that we're a partner for called Tatara Social in terms of technology. And then really importantly, social learning doesn't just happen. A couple of times with organizations, we've mentored and supported facilitators to make it happen and been part of that journey with organizations. So essentially, I'm going to talk about the different types of social learning and when to use them, approaches to community building, and then some success factors around social learning and what a community manager does and why they're really key to it all. Humans are social, and in some ways, I think all learning's social. In the summary for this particular webinar, I talked about the idea in the 70-20-10 model that the 20 is in the middle, and it's the thing that holds together quite often formal learning and performance actually in the workplace in the 70. It's a really powerful sort of way of bringing things together is the best way to put it. There's a lot of social learning theories where essentially the idea is people construct knowledge and build knowledge and understanding as a group, and they learn as much from each other as what they do from resources and facilitation. So I started the session by asking the group about why social learning doesn't work, and I'll just grab my notes around this, and it's really interesting because I really thought a few things that when people came back up with things that they actually didn't. There were things I weren't quite expecting, which is why I'm bringing them back up in the summary. Things like lack of understanding of the value of social learning, poor communication about what it is, a fear about how it works and what people actually need to do, and then distractions and lack of time as well, and needing a strong community to start with. But essentially, one of the themes that came up from a couple of people were really misunderstandings around the benefits of it, and also a lack of understanding as well. So I think those are really interesting things I'll try to pick up a little bit later in some of the recordings as well, especially around the fear factor as well. Essentially, what we've started to work with at Sprout Labs is the notion that social learning has two other key words that go along with it. One, that it needs to be structured, and then it needs to be specific. And there's sort of two different types of social learning. There's sort of the discussions, which are highly structured, and then the virtual water cooler sort of style of online social learning, which is possibly the utopian vision of a continuous learning environment where, in actual fact, learning is accelerated and enabled by social learning technologies so that there's more peer communication. Really good example of these is things like user groups, so user groups around pieces of software. Yes, and then I think of these as being really specific. Likewise, another form of specific social learning is when a Yammer group might be formed around a particular project, and that might have project champions, and that's the sort of trying to give it some specific and putting some structure into it. This sort of virtual water cooler is possibly the hardest way to start, but it's also, if it works, possibly has the largest level of returns as well. The other end of things is using online discussions and social learning as part of a blend. There's a few really important things and ways that this can be made more structured. One, quite often people just sort of open discussions topics with sort of, oh, let's talk about such and such, or finish a face-to-face session or a virtual classroom and say, oh, let's move this discussion online. They need a lot more structure to them. So they need to start with what we call a spark. And spark is a thing that really sort of gives people something to react against or for, and really sort of sparks their interest in it. Then there's a couple of other ways, which is essentially around building a online asynchronous thing into something that's more synchronous, giving it a time frame, a period to do it in. One of these techniques is called a barn raising. Wikipedia quite often do them when they're actually wanting to move into a new content area. So what happens is they sit there and say, we want to populate, say, more pages around Australian Paralympics Olympians. What we're going to do is organise events in each capital city. That might be a Saturday afternoon, and we're going to get a whole lot of Paralympians in at that particular time to work on their pages. We're going to show them how to do it, and we're going to time frame it and time box it and give it some energy behind it, so it becomes possibly a little bit less flexible, but it becomes a lot more structured around time. Likewise, running events where you might sit there and say it's an online jam, and online jams are almost like online brainstorming sessions, where essentially a topic, an event might only run for 24 hours. We've done them in ways where they might only run for a morning, and we've actually put it into people's calendars to make sure that they actually do turn up and allocate that time. There are other approaches like interactive storytelling, which and role plays. They can really be in a spot where these can be quite exciting because people can sort of get out of their own normal experience and role play a different role. Quite often the people who actually hate face-to-face role plays can be really engaged by the online role-playing experience as well. These discussions are a really good stepping stone, really good way of making people more comfortable with working and communicating online. And that was one of the things I really didn't expect with that whole, what was the barriers to social learning. And the first slide was because I sort of feel like we're a whole lot better at this online communication bit than what we used to be. So it was interesting it came back up again. This sort of approach to sort of integrating and structuring social communication between people online as part of blended learning programs really reworks the way people learn, but doesn't so much rework the way that people actually work, because of, say, the water cooler one's more integrated into projects and user groups and actual things people are doing. Cool. So, some types of social learning. On the left-hand side, I have some categories of social learning and then some ideas about when they can be used. So let's start with this thing that I've just been talking about of threaded discussions. Threaded discussions are great for debatable topics, things that possibly have some different ways people can approach the ideas. They're also great when a learner needs to reflect. So there's some topics and some things where they're too complicated. They're legal concepts, and the actual wording of things is really important. They don't make great face-to-face or virtual classroom conversations. They actually do need to be explored in a written form. So threaded discussions can be great for that. They're also sometimes the people who are not comfortable in a face-to-face or talking need more time to reflect, and they'll come back out of themselves in a threaded discussion situation. Next tool is commenting. Commenting systems are great when you actually have a bit of content, a piece of video, a blog post, and you want someone to react to those. Sometimes people try to actually use these in a way that's more like a threaded discussion to actually spark something and spark a debate. They don't always make a really great tool for that particular thing. Virtual classrooms I include in the range of social learning. Essentially, virtual classrooms, if they're actually smaller than what we now end up doing at Sprout Labs, of about between 10 to 15 people, can actually be great spots to have discussions. and really explore complex topics that need sort of in-depth exploration that might have lots of grey areas to them. So you can do things where you can actually put a scenario out and then really explore it or role play that and think through that. Updates, text and images. This is really the classic Facebook style of social learning, or Yammer, where they're just sort of simple, very quick. This is what you're working on. It can be great for questions and answers, and also an approach that I'll talk a little bit about in a few moments called working out loud. We probably have an overemphasis in terms of wanting this particular style of learning particular style of tool to be actually used, because we see it as being so powerful in sharing and connecting with people in our personal lives. We want to try. Some people want to try to do the same thing with work. Work's different. We have different motivations, different value propositions. So this particular one doesn't actually work for everyone in all work situations. So I'd actually strongly encourage you, if you're starting out using social learning in your programs, to work with things more like the threaded discussions and virtual classrooms as your starting points rather than the updates. And then as people become more comfortable, move to the other ones. Not to be underestimated is tools like collaborative editing of text and media, wikis, Google Docs, Wikispaces, and some of the features in SharePoint as well. These are great ways of being able to build, share, and review knowledge. One of the most powerful activities, and I've blogged about it recently, is being able to get a group of people together and build a book of knowledge, a summary of how practice works and what people do and how they're doing it, or building a playbook of, if this happens, we do such and such, and building that in a collaborative way. So essentially my thing is, in actual fact, social learning is not just about talking, it's also about that sort of notion of building things as well. Last but not least is group chat, things like Slack. Slack's been extensively adopted in the startups. Chatter, that's part of Salesforce, is quite often used in corporate enterprises. These are really actually great ways of being able to have simple sharing and simple discussions. It's really interesting because we use Slack at Sprout Labs. So essentially quite often we might start a discussion on Slack. It becomes too complicated. We have to move into a voice-based conferencing tool that's either the one in Slack or something else like WebEx to actually deal with the complexity of the topic. But it's really the lovely thing about the group chat things is there's just a set of intimacy and speed around how they're working, and we're also seeing this in our personal life with things like the increased use of Snapchat as well. To talk a little bit more about working out loud, I'm not a working out loud expert. This is John Stepper's summary of it. So the whole idea is that you start to work in a way with a group of people where you're communicating what you're doing and supporting other people around you. One way that John Stepper has a really great way of building these is working out loud circles. Essentially, these actually are about getting a group of small people together that possibly sometimes have never worked together before, and everyone sets a goal and then communicates progress and knowledge and what they're learning as they're working towards that goal. Can be very simple and quite often encourages the use of Slack as well with this particular thing. Now, in blended learning, we quite often find we have what I call the hierarchy of presence. Hierarchy of presence is really this idea that if you've got face-to-face virtual classrooms and then text-based discussions, the bit in the mix, in the blend that actually has the highest level of presence always dominates. So if you have a face-to-face session, people always fixate on that and engage more with a face-to-face session than, say, the virtual classrooms or the discussions. If you then just have virtual classrooms and discussions. Repeatedly, I've seen, both as a participant and as a designer, that the virtual classrooms become the dominant medium because it's actually more intimate and has more presence in the discussions. So in some ways, some of the most successful social learning programs I've ever seen are actually 100% text-based, that they don't mix the other types of presence up, because in actual fact, then you can get more energy happening around that. So back to my fictional L&D manager, Rebecca. Her organisation wants to build a blended learning program about agile project management. So some of the thoughts that came back up from the group around what and Rebecca could do is build a role play. Was one of the things. Targeted questions for the group to consider, so problems that might happen as they start to implement agile. A small group project to start with that's managed through online, and then a case study that might be in a spot that's less open as a full role play. It might be just more, actually, here's a case study. What would you do in this particular spot? So it's sort of building the sparks around case studies. Now, there was one day at a conference when a vendor said to me, oh, look, our system doesn't need a facilitator or a community manager. People just engage with it and it just happens. At that particular moment, I went, actually, that's completely opposite to how I've ever seen any social learning work. Quite often, when you have a meeting, you do need a structure. You need someone who moves things along. You need an agenda. You need someone to sort of think it through. If you just actually have a blank canvas, nothing happens. And I think that is actually one of the things, that if you don't have that structure and it's not specific, and then you don't have people to support the actual experience, then the community really flounders. Now I'm just realising I've got a new mic and I'm not always getting close enough to the microphone. So hopefully this recording's working out. Now, a little while ago on the Sprout Labs blog, we put together a what does a community manager do? This was actually a combination of ideas from us, as well as we went out to some clients and asked what the community managers do. So essentially, we ended up with these four things and these four ideas. At Sprout Labs, we have lots of sort of gardening and ecosystem metaphors. So I quite like the idea that a community manager is a gardener. So the first thing they do is really, they're the people that start the conversations. They plant the seeds, they share resources that people then respond to. Then they help those seeds grow by being really supportive of the community members. They're encouraging them, they're supporting, they're asking questions, and being positive about their involvement, especially during the early stages. Then they're weeding as well to make sure that the community tone is right and it's healthy. So then essentially, if someone's in a spot where it's not a professional interaction, they're challenging that. They're also doing what I think is actually, I've grown to really think this is really important. They're harvesting, they're telling the stories, they're communicating to people outside the community and outside the social network what's happening as well. So, and in a spot where they're just not just working within the community, they're also communicating outside that as well. Did a little bit of an activity about whether or not this role was more management or leadership, because when I actually did this particular blog post, a client turned around and said, hey Robin, I think that really is a leadership thing. Why have you actually called that a management thing? Now what was really interesting with the group was we ended up in a spot where most people ended up talking about it being a mixture of leadership and management skills. And this was interesting for me because this is probably where I sat as well, is in this middle space. I quite like to think of it as a management role because I find that makes organisations feel a little bit more comfortable with it as a role, but it's also at its core really a leadership activity. Now, one of the frameworks that I think is really useful for thinking about community building and thinking about the design of learning activities for online social learning is this model from Gilly Salmon. It's quite old. I think it's probably about 15 years old now. I think it was not particularly new. But I think what's interesting is that quite often we enter wanting a community to work at a stage where it's sharing knowledge and constructing knowledge, and we sort of forget that it's got these steps of making sure that people have access to the platform to start with, and then they've got some sort of online socialization happening before they can actually really start to function. And then really the higher order things happen later. So if you're designing a sort of learning program using these sorts of tools, then you need to make sure people have these first things. So some of these things are really simple icebreakers. Many icebreakers that can be used face-to-face can actually also be used online. Simple sparks like what's your favorite resource around such and such? And then the other really important factor at this particular moment is to find people in your learner group to actually exhibit the role that you want, of someone who's open, someone who's encouraging. You'll find that there's people who are actually naturally like that. And you can harness those people and then really work with them to help build the community as well. You can almost plant them, is the way I think about it, is to sit there and ring them and say, oh, look, we're just not launching such and such discussion topic. Can you go in and respond for me, please? Now, essentially, Rebecca's got this classic problem that their social learning system is a ghost town. And then we did a little bit of brainstorming around this particular one. And I think this was interesting because there were some really great ideas that came through with this. Just grab the notes so you can hear a bit of background noise. So tentatives were some of the ideas. Actually having senior leaders participate, which is one of those key success factors that we've seen repeatedly. Look for people that are influencers, restarting things and doing more icebreakers. And another idea was in terms of facilitation skills, direct questioning. Sit there and ask someone who's posted, what do you think about such and such? And then generally a general promotion of social learning as well. And also talking to people offline as well as a way of encouraging them to become involved in the online. Now, I talked a little bit before about the approach of really focusing on text-based discussions first. One of the things that can be quite successful is what we call content-free courses. You know how there's topics where essentially in face-to-face, you can walk into a group and almost build through an understanding in a group through questions only. You can do the same sort of thing with online discussions as well. So this particular model works in a way where the discussion space happens in your social learning platform or your discussions in your learning management system, but it's really triggered by email messages going back out. And please don't underestimate the fact that we live in our inboxes, and most people will complain about how much email they get, but if you remove the notifications and things happening to their inbox, they disengage. So this particular blueprint and approach works in a way where you start with a spark, something that sort of might be a case study or a debatable topic, might be something that where there's a bit of controversial things, might be something that can be interpreted in multiple different ways. This is sent out to the group as well as a personal message. Sorry, I'll go back to that one. And then the facilitator starts to ask questions. Then depending on what's happening in terms of the engagement, the facilitator might then send out an email message to the people not participating to say such and such is happening online, to make them realise that what they're missing out on and to try to help them engage with that in a different way. Then at the end of the week, and this is actually part of it, it's a time box. It's not a continuous thing. It might be a week, might be 10 days, might be 2 weeks. So people have to have a time that they engage with it. And after that period of time, the facilitator moves on, and they move on to the next topic. it includes a weekly summary, or the facilitator does a weekly summary that gets emailed around to everyone, and that includes statements by everyone who's participated in the discussion. So you're sort of reconfirming what's been said, you're bringing it together, making sure that there's actually, if the topic's diverted and the main points haven't been actually made, this is a chance for the facilitator to pick those things up. Sometimes this is also a chance to add some notes about the topic to help bring it together as well. It's a classic sort of summary that happens at the end of a session of, so we've talked about such and such, we brought up such and such, and this is what we've learned from it, but done online as well. So there's been a few success factors that we've seen work, and I just want to run through those. And I've even talked about one of them really quickly already. The first one is senior managers being involved. So it's being seen as something really important, and that they see value in it and they're actually participating as well. This solves a lot of the benefit problems and the time problems as well. Thinking beyond sharing and discussions, thinking about what people can build is really important and really key as well. Then the other thing in terms of facilitation, if you sit there and go, well, I'm not quite sure how to facilitate face-to-face online, it's very similar to what you do face-to-face. If someone's not engaging, what do? You ask them questions. You, in this particular spot, you might actually ring them. And to remember that sometimes some people actually just don't want to engage as well. The other thing to remember is social learning doesn't particularly scale well. We've actually repeatedly found that essentially having smaller groups of people, between 10 to 20 in a group, is actually particularly richer and gives better results than having 50 people. I mean, if you think about it, we're all a lot more comfortable working in a group of people that might be 10 to 20 people rather than actually asking a question in a big lecture situation of 50 people. I'm not quite sure if anyone's ever, and I've never seen a face-to-face discussion happen with 50 people. It's quite a difficult thing to actually achieve. Giving it a time frame, I think, is important. This whole giving it a week and giving it a time, beginning, middle, and end, rather than just being a continuous thing that happens in the background. This is part of this whole notion of giving it some structure. Even the working out loud approach actually has quite a lot of structure to it, and that's one of the reasons why I think it actually works so well. One of the ways we've used to bring some of these things together is what we call the community practice canvas. These are visual planning tools that when you're working in the middle of the workshop, you put them up on the wall as AO, and you work with sticky notes around each of them. I think the thing about these things is that it gives you a chance to be able to focus not just on the key practice activities, but also who the stakeholders are and the value proposition for members and the organisation as well. So it gives it, for me, it gives it a set of questions you can ask to make sure you're getting and thinking through all parts of what's happening, not just what people are doing and who's going to be part of it. And also making sure your cost is also matching what the value proposition is going to be as well. Now, to try to bring some of this together, and to hopefully just to repeat that some of the themes I think are really important to making social learning work is making sure it's structured and specific. And if there's two words that you take away from this particular recording, please, I hope those are what you've got. Now, our next webinar is on trends in digital learning, and that's happening on, I think it's the 26th of October. So if you're listening to this recording after that, there will be actually a recording of that you can probably access as well. Thank you for listening and watching.